Hello, everyone. Welcome to study number 12 in the book of James. James's letter to the Christians of about 42 to 43 AD, just a few years after Christ's resurrection from the dead. We're going to begin at James 4, verse 13 today. And the thing that James addresses in our text is the matter of the rich, the well-to-do, the powerful, society's leaders, the wealthy businessman he speaks of in chapter 4 and also in chapter 5. He takes aim at a very influential group of people. I guess we would call that politically incorrect, wouldn't we? But not exactly, but you get my idea. That the idea is that James now takes aim at those who are the distinguished, the well-heeled, the good, those who have money, those who are looked upon with respect. And he says there's something wrong with the rich. The church historian Martin Marty once wrote that the title of James should be this: For good news, turn elsewhere. I think that's a great example, because the book of James is about our obligations, about how we failed so often to be the people of God. And that strikes me as very appropriate, because as we've gone through here, haven't we had our feet stomped on enough as we've gone through these chapters together? So to the rich, beware, because that's who he's aiming his comments at. And we're going to start with verse 13 of James chapter 4, and we will finish our study today in James 5, verse 6. So I'll start with chapter 4, verse 13, and then read through 17, and then we'll talk about that for a little bit. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. That last passage about failing to do the things you know to do is not written in a vacuum, and I'll try to explain that in just a moment. Now remember, James was written to people whose churches, Jewish churches mostly, in the early years of the church, maybe 10 to 12 years old, were having tremendous controversies. And apparently they were not about doctrine. They were about personalities, about teachers, about the power of certain teachers, and the personality cults I've talked about, people that just folks like, and that they would probably get around that teacher and support that teacher. In Corinth, where you have the divisions and this personality cult, you have also problems with doctrine. But it does not appear to be the case in James. It just doesn't appear that there's any gospel doctrine like the resurrection or something like that is being fussed about, or about leadership, or about eating meat offered to idols, or about grace and faith. It doesn't appear to be the issue. James's issue is, hey, you claim to have faith, so live it. Live like you have faith. Live the life of a disciple. Don't just talk about faith. Live a life of faith. So he fearlessly, at this point, aims at the influential and well-to-do, the wealthy, the rich, he says. This isn't the first time that he singled out the rich, by the way, already. In James 1, verses 10 and 11, he speaks of the rich fading away while they pursue their wealth and power. And then again, in James chapter 2, verses 3 through 5, he scolds the brothers and sisters for showing favoritism to rich people when they walk into their assemblies. And then in James 2, verse 6, he reminds the regular folks who are sucking up to the rich that it's the rich who actually oppress them and make life difficult for them. He points out the illogic of it, of why are you treating these people so nicely when they treat you so badly? So the rich are getting rich off your backs, off your labor. And that is wrong. He says for you to show favoritism to the rich when they mistreat you. So now we're in chapter 4, and he speaks of the businessman who presumes upon the future. Hey, I'm going to conduct business, this hypothetical businessman, although I think James may be speaking of someone specifically or about an attitude. He says, let's conduct our business and let's make money today and tomorrow and have a profit. Now, James is not saying that we shouldn't do business here and there and make a profit. He's not condemning profit. He is specifically condemning the prideful spirit that comes with expecting God to provide you a day in which to get richer. He's already told them that the rich are going to fade away in their pursuits. And now he says, you know something, rich man? Your life is a poof of steam. It's there for a moment and then it is gone. And live like that, ever in mind, humbly before God, and realize that all of us live by the grace of God. That life comes from Him, and that we need to recognize that. Of all the things I've learned in my life and continue to learn is that life is short. When I was in my childhood, I remember how long it used to be till we get to Christmas. I remember we had a candle, and we would begin to burn that candle at our dinner table on the 1st of December. And when the 24th came, we'd burn the last notch in the candle. But oh, it seemed to take forever to burn that candle down. Oh, I remember thinking it's going to take forever. And when I was in my childhood, that was just how I remember time flying. It didn't fly, it more like crawled. But when I was in my teens, it would take forever to get to the end of a school year. But I have to confess that the candle burning at Christmas went by a whole lot faster. And then when I entered my 20s, I became surprised at how rapidly the bills came every month. I said, another month passed already? I got another rent payment to make, or I've got another light bill to pay. When I got to my 30s, I began to notice how quickly my own children were growing up. The occasions that we go to, the spring concerts, the Christmas parties, the Christmas plays, and all of those performances that would come up year by year. And I would say to Deb, I'd say, wow, weren't we just at this a few days ago? And she would always remind me, well, no, it's been a year. And how quickly the years went by in my 30s. And then in my 40s, I realized that I wouldn't heal as quickly when I would hurt myself. But the days sure flew by. It seemed like the only thing that was going slow was my ability to recover from injury or from exhaustion. In my 50s, I would measure time by decades. We'd have a discussion about something that happened, and we'd discuss at the table. Now, was that the 70s or the 80s? Or was it the 90s? Or was it Y2K? We were all, and then now in the 60s, I can't believe it's been 20 years since the turn of the millennium. We're at 2020. 20 years since we turned over 2000. And I can scarcely believe it. James' words really have they zing themselves right to my heart at how quickly life does go by. And I don't know what the 70s will be like, if, Lord willing, I live that long. But if I'm still here, I'll tell you, and may I be as blunt as James is here? I won't be blunt, but I'll tell it like he tells it. Our dying always comes as a surprise. I think there's a part of us that always hopes we'll live forever. I have met many people in their 90s who are surprised they're sick all the time. They're surprised. It's because we're never really quite ready to die. And James just puts it out there. He says, your life is a poof of steam, out of a teapot, if you will, that just appears and then is gone. That's our life he's talking about. Death comes unexpectedly, and life is short. And I've known people in their 90s to tell me that their lives were too short, that they had more things they wanted to get done. And we're a death-denying culture. Kifa Sempangi was a preacher in Uganda. He lived through some of the worst times, tribal warfare, Islamic persecution. He saved his family numerous times from brutal oppression and terror. They finally escaped Uganda and were able to get to Philadelphia where they could live in safety. And a group of Christians began to care for them because they had been such good disciples, so faithful in their work for God. And one day his wife said, "Tomorrow I'm going to buy some clothes for the children." And immediately she and her husband broke into tears. And I wondered as I continued to read the story, why did she break into tears when she said, "Tomorrow we're going to buy the kids some clothes"? And the reason that she cried is because for the first time in many years, she dared to even speak of the word tomorrow, because day by day they didn't know whether they were going to live. We certainly take tomorrow for granted. That terrifying experience of living in Uganda at that particular time taught them something we all need to learn, that there is no assurance of tomorrow, that the only time we can be sure of having is what we have right now, today. And I want to share a side lesson to that passage about the shortness of our lives. You know, there are only 2 days in every week about which we should not worry. 2 days that we shouldn't worry about at all, that we should be kept free from anxiety. One of those days is yesterday. It's mistakes, it's cares, it's foul-ups, it's aches, it's pains, it's blunders, it's faults. You can't do anything. Yesterday is past forever. It can't be undone. It can't be redone. All the money in the world cannot undo a single act that we performed yesterday. We cannot erase a single word we've said. We can't rectify a single mistake. Yesterday has passed forever beyond recall. So let yesterday go. There's another day we shouldn't worry about, and that is tomorrow. We don't worry about yesterday, and we don't worry about tomorrow either, with its possible adversities and its burdens and its anxieties, unknowns, or poor performance, which is certainly going to happen to all of us. Tomorrow is beyond our immediate control too. And should Jesus delay his coming, tomorrow's sun is either going to rise in splendor or it's going to be behind a mass of clouds, but it will rise. And until it does, we really don't have any stake in tomorrow. Not yet. Because tomorrow hasn't happened yet. Plan like you'll live forever, maybe, but live like you only have today. Plan like you are going to live forever, but live like you only have today. The only 2 days that we don't have to worry about are tomorrow and yesterday. Several years ago, I knew a gentleman who entered hospice services where I was chaplain. He was in his early 60s. He was about 60 years of age. He had worked all of his life so he could take early retirement. He had worked all of his life so he could take early retirement. He'd stuck it out with his employer for all those years, got himself a great pension, and the day of his retirement came, and all the excitement and all the planning for that day ended on the first day of his retirement, and he came up ill. And so he went to his physician to find out what it was so he could get on with living the kind of retired life that he wanted to live. Within 1 week of his retirement day, he was diagnosed with cancer and he died. He asked me so many times, why? I've done all of this all my life. I got myself set up where I could retire early and comfortably. He'd planned so long to ride on his boat and to travel and to enjoy vacations and new places and to be with his wife, but he died in the first week of his retirement. And I have never, ever forgotten that. And I have never forgotten what James reminds us. Don't presume on tomorrow, because we don't know what will happen. James calls our expectation of tomorrow the presumption of a tomorrow. He doesn't say it's just unwise. He calls it arrogance. If you want James to tell, you don't ask James for an honest answer or evaluation unless you're willing to take it. That kind of living that says, I'm going to make it to this age and then do this and do that, he calls that arrogance. And he says, and when we boast of that, it's evil. The first time I read this afresh, every time I study this passage, I go back over and say, how would I take this as a person at my age? How am I receiving this? And I thought, oh my goodness, James, you're kind of being tough. No, James is telling it like it is. He's pushing us to holiness. He's saying that expectation of further time is a presumption based on pride. And if we boast about it, it's evil. So let's be careful. I don't think that James is calling on us here to say, well, we need to always say if the Lord wills. Well, you don't have to say it if you don't mean it. But we need to think about it every time we say it, that if the Lord wills that this happens, then we'll do it. That's humble. That recognizes that our time is not our own, that it's a gift from God. And these words, by the way, reminding you, are aimed at the well-to-do and the wealthy. They're applicable to all of us, but they are aimed at the wealthy. Can we really afford to delay walking with Jesus and obeying him and trusting him? To presume we have more time is a risky proposition at best, and James would tell us that's pride at its worst. And then in verse 17, James writes this, and at first blush, it doesn't appear to go along with anything he's just said. It doesn't seem to fit in the flow of admonitions, but I think I might have an idea of why it fits. He states, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. I've always used that passage as an evidence that none of us will ever get the Christian life right. Because there's nobody who never fails to do the right thing. We might be able to keep from doing the wrong thing, but I don't know how many times I have failed to do the right thing, and nor do you, because most of the sins that we think about are sins of commission, not omission. The things that we do. We'll say things, well, like I never killed anybody, and I've never committed adultery, and I've never done this, and I've never stolen from my neighbor, I've never coveted my neighbor's wife, I've never, and we go on the list. Never stolen, all those big sins. It is just as wrong to do something wrong as it is to fail to do something right. And I scratched my head at that and I said, well, two things. Number one, what hope does any of us have? Do any of us have? And the second thing I think about is what has that got to do with what he's been talking about our lives, about the shortness of our lives. And I think it may have something to do with this. The rich cannot say, I didn't know or I wasn't aware of the needs of the poor. We can't say, well, I didn't steal from the poor man. Or the rich man may say, which may be a debatable point because of the oppressions upon the poor, but in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, it wasn't the rich man's commission of a sin that condemned him. It was his failure to do the right thing for a poor man who laid at his gate. He was dressed in fine clothes, had a big house to live in. You can read about the story in the book of Luke. The poor man at his gate, Lazarus, had nothing, little food, no home, rags for clothes. It says that Lazarus lived on the garbage the rich man threw out, and his only companions in his misery were the dogs who licked his open sores, which were likely due to malnutrition or disease. And the rich man did nothing. Whose fault was it that Lazarus was in that condition? Poor, hungry, covered in sores. Maybe nobody. Maybe it was just misfortune. But whose fault was it that Lazarus stayed that way? The rich man's. He could have done something more than allow this man to eat his garbage. The rich man had no excuse, according to James' reasoning. If you see good to do, and you have the means to do it, Don't miss the opportunity. He calls it sin when you deliberately neglect doing something good for someone who needs you to do it, particularly if it has to do with that person's survival. And when we who are rich turn our backs on the poor, we sin. And we can say all day long, well, I haven't done anything to hurt the poor. But James would say, but you didn't do anything to help them either. No, we didn't maybe actively mistreat them. No, we didn't kick them. We didn't cuss them. But we didn't help them. James says that's sin too. And that's why James takes away all our excuses there. That's why that passage is there. If you see something good to do and you don't do it, he's talking to the rich. He said it's sin. And that's a sobering thought, how we need to be about helping the poor in some way. Knowing that it's not going to be enough to say to ourselves, well, I never did anything really bad, when we missed hundreds of opportunities to do good. And James then rains down judgment on the indifferent rich again. He has one last volley, if you will, about to the oppressive rich. And we know who these people are. Business owners who treat their employees like oxen, who pull a load for a bale of hay. Or entrepreneurs who destroy people on the way to the top of their businesses. In our culture today, I'm not condemning capitalism. I think capitalism is the most ingenious way to run an economy that ever has been. And I'm not here to talk about politics, but I am here to say this, that those that have used capitalism, many have destroyed other people doing it and continue to do that. Continue to exploit the poor. Continue to underpay people who really need to make a living and work very hard. Look at James 5 as we close up here. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. I do not know if there are more harsh words in all of the New Testament than James' final wake-up call to the rich. We got a lot of these kinds of rich folks around even today. Let's not pretend that this was just a first century phenomenon. People haven't changed all that much. Folks who make it impossible for their employees to buy health insurance, or whose employees can't afford childcare. They may not excuse themselves by saying, well, I don't mistreat my employees. I didn't wrong them. I paid them on time. I ran a successful business. But if you saw good that could be done for those who work for you and you do not do it, it is sin. And before you think I'm carrying the water for some political party, I'm not. Because in this matter, James was not political. Taking care of employees was not a political issue. It is a spiritual issue. So both Democrats, Republicans, and independents mistreat their employees and then climb behind their mantles of self-righteousness and say, but I go to church. I've never mistreated anybody. I give to the church. Our lack of concern for the people who work for us, our indifference toward employees who struggle to make ends meet, that is our problem. It is sin to see good to be done and not do it. And James is saying the rich have no defense for doing nothing. In fact, worse yet, he says judgment is coming. Like a roaring freight train still a good ways down the track, but certainly and quickly approaching. James sees things that we don't see here. He sees past the money, the portfolios, and the clothes, and the houses. He says your portfolios are worthless. He said your well-tailored clothes are in tatters. He said, your gold and silver hedge funds are worthless. He said, those stocks and bonds you think will provide you security are no security at all. He said, you fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. Wake up, he says. Wake up. Money is not your security. That's not your treasure. And that's a chilling warning. These folks were withholding pay from their laborers. Every day during James's time, if you went out and mowed in the field, like he mentions here about harvesters getting hay, every day, he said, you've defrauded your employees who worked your fields. You gave some excuse for not paying somebody. The cries of those harvesters have reached the ears of the Almighty. He said, you're self-indulgent and you live in luxury, and God sees it all. The rich have, in effect, murdered the righteous person. You have murdered them. And then he says, he can't resist your power play because he has all the power. He holds all the money, the decision-making ability. And the poor man has no recourse except God sees. Since some of us do pretty well in comparison with the rest of the world, including me, James' words hold a heavy obligation. Since indifference is no longer an excuse for the hoarding of wealth, because we deprive the poor when we hoard wealth, then we need to watch for the needs of others. We need to live our faith. Of course, we should be prudent in whom and how we help, but we can't write off a whole segment of people just because they're poor. God has a special love for the poor. He says that the poor have a special place in God's kingdom. Jesus said that. He gives grace to humble, downtrodden folks. Dr. Carl Menninger, a world-famous psychiatrist from Kansas, was answering questions after he gave a lecture on mental health. And one person asked him, I said, what would you advise someone to do if he felt a nervous breakdown coming on? Great question. What do you do if you feel like you're about to have a meltdown? And most people expected Dr. Menninger to say, well, go see a psychiatrist, go to a therapist, get some counseling or something. Instead, he said, lock up your house, go across the railroad tracks, find someone in need, and do something to help that person. You don't need to feel a nervous breakdown coming on if you want to live the fulfilling life of Jesus Christ. Just give. We'll pick up in James 5:7 next time, but I really appreciate you joining me today. Thank you.